Gentlemen, Excellencies, welcome to tonight's event, the Strategic Review on Global Hotspots 2023. My name is Markus. I'm the new director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to this event at the Diplomatic Academy. In particular, I would like to welcome our point of contact from the Ministry of Defense, Hermann Mayer. Thank you very much for being here, also in representation for all excellencies that are here from your ministry, and Ambassador Cristiani on behalf of all representatives from foreign ministries, from the diplomatic corps, but also from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. This is the third year in a row that we're organizing this event, the Strategic Review on Global Hotspots. In the past 2 years, the topics were similar, but nonetheless, of course, the current events, especially with regards to the Russian aggression and invasion of Ukraine, have shaped the global security landscape in the sense that we will focus today in particular on the events in Ukraine. We have a slight difference in our speakers tonight due to the fact that Mr. Reisner unfortunately had to cancel his participation very spontaneously. Nonetheless, we are very happy to welcome Walter Feichtinger, the president of the Center for Strategic Analysis, to take his part and also to speak on the current events in Ukraine. Thank you very much for being with us. We also have 3 other distinguished speakers with us tonight. Mr. Wolfgang Pusztai, who will speak on the Northern African region with the focus on Libya, Gudrun Harrer, who will focus on the Middle East, and Dr. Werner Fasslabend, who is going to speak on the Far East, East Asia, and the events in the South China Sea, and also with regards to Taiwan. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much to the audience. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over the word and the floor to our moderator tonight, Roland Adrowitzer, the former head of the correspondents from the Austrian media, the ORF. Thank you very much for moderating this event tonight, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here in the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, and those who are following us on live stream. Last time we had quite a lot watching us, and hope it will be tonight the same audience. Well, unfortunately, definitely we have no shortages on global hotspots these days. There are hardly any region without being a global hotspot now. Foremost, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine going on for more than a year now. The retired Brigadier General Walter Feichtinger will give us an update on the situation as well, and on the consequences this war and this tragic conflict will have on the whole security system in Europe. From Europe, then from the Ukraine, we then move on to North Africa, unfortunately, as well, partly an area of destabilization and conflict. Only a few examples: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. Wolfgang Pusztai, security and policy analyst and senior advisor to the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, will talk and will inform us, brief us on the situation there. Then from North Africa to the Middle East, civil unrest and suppression in Iran. On the other side now, rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Israel's most far-right government ever. Benjamin Netanyahu is in Germany today. Senior and distinguished journalist Gudrun Harrer from the newspaper Der Standard will brief and inform us on the Middle East. And last but not least, East Asia. We receive hostile messages from China's leadership, from President Xi Jinping, from the new foreign minister, talks about the Chinese army forming a wall of steel, Taiwan and President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, Werner Fasslabend, will talk on East Asia. But let's start with Ukraine. Please, Walter Fechtinger. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I have to confess, I cannot answer the most urgent question, when the war will end. But I'll do my best to come close to it, and I invite you to follow me in this way by showing up some, I would say, developments and so on, and to identify some points that could lead to an answer to this most urgent question. Let us start. A few words on Ukrainian dynamics in the war. The third point will be when will it end? And geostrategic impact. So, just a few words on dynamics in warfare. What we are witnessing, what we are observing is we are entering the third phase of war in Ukraine. The first phase war was Russia was in the offensive. The second, it was from March, from the very beginning, to, I would say, mid of September. Then we had phase two, counterattacks from the Ukrainian side, to the mid of December, I would say. And we are now still in an interim period, and that is over, because now we are really in a third phase, and the third phase is a new attempt from the Russian side to conquer more of the country than it was possible before. The interim period was very important and very interesting, I would say, because some elements of it are still in place. When we see weekly a bombing of many critical infrastructure in Ukraine, that is part of that interim period, because that was an indicator that Russia is not in a situation to conquer the whole country, but to keep the country down and to keep pressure on the whole country and the government. And that is why it is so important to demoralize, consolidate, and prepare for the third phase. Elements of it are rockets, cruise missiles all over the country, and preparing for the next phase. And the phase started, I would say, 3 weeks ago. It is not a huge offensive that we are witnessing now, but we have many single attacks, over 100 attacks a day during the last weeks. It was decreasing during the last week to 20 to 30 small attempts, but it is on the way, it is ongoing. And where is the hotspot in the war here today? We see it from, it is in the front of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, Bakhmut, and all the small places and villages that are under fire, and that is really a concentration of fire and war fighting in that region. To give you the bigger picture, that is what you see between the blue in the north and the blue in the southwest. This part is, I would say, under attack, and that is why we are getting daily new information of the war without any decision on the battlefield. What we are witnessing now is a hot war fighting without any decision. And what we are expecting, or what some experts expect during the next 2 months, I would say, is a counter-offensive from the Ukrainian forces. And many of them expect them here, you see. What is the intention by having a counterattack like that? It is to separate the land bridge between Mariupol and Crimea. Nobody knows whether it will come. That is part of the game, I would say. You can say we are preparing for that. In 1 week, you will attack in the north, in the northern part of Luhansk, for example. So it is part of the intelligence gaming here, not to be sure, to have uncertainty on both sides what will happen in the near future. But it will happen. Something will happen that is expectable. Brings me to the stock taking in military terms. So we are entering phase 3, as I explained, and what we see daily is the question of how many resources are available on both sides. It's about ammunition, it's about personnel, it's about tanks, it's about heavy equipment, it's about capabilities. It's not enough to have a lot of equipment. You have to have trained units. You have to have tactics in order to gain some effort on the battleground. And it is also a question of how many reserves do you have. And in this regard, in this comparison, the Russian side, I would say, is in a better position than the Ukrainian. Because the Ukrainian side is heavily dependent on Western support. So a big question mark is, how long will this support will be? And on the Russian side, you have a huge population. You can mobilize another 300,000, 400,000 men. It is possible. And you have a lot of equipment. It is not the most modern tanks, but it is a lot of them. And that is what we are seeing. They are bringing more and more and having such severe losses, but it doesn't change their behavior. They rely on heavy artillery, shelling, and so on and so forth. And it is a race against time in many dimensions. It's a race against time on the Ukrainian side. How long will the Western support last? What will be in the United States when it comes to the next election? And in the period before already, there are some signs and indicators that the US support will not be the same after the next election. So it puts pressure on the Ukrainian side. And you have a pressure also on a time pressure also on the Russian side. How fast will the Western equipment, the modern tanks, come to the Ukrainians? Because they are in fear of that. They know that they are not as good as their old tanks they have brought to the battlefield. So a race against time in many dimensions is on the place. Multidimensional warfare, I will explain it a little bit later. Do we see a limitless and an endless war? Limitless is meaning including all elements you can imagine, including nuclear weapons. We don't know. Many people say it is not really expectable, but you cannot exclude it. And endless means how long will it last? That depends highly on the position of the Russian president and the support of the West. And what is the ultimate goal? What can be enough for President Putin? What can be enough for the Ukrainian president, Zelensky? Do we have already a point of return where we can go back to square one and say, okay, let's go to negotiations? Well, let's have talks at least. I do not see a point of return yet. I do not see that we are at the ultimate situation, the culmination of a war. Yeah, the point of culmination of a war. I do not see it yet, because both sides are too strong to fail and too weak to win. So what do I mean by saying multidimensional warfare? We see the conventional fight. We see economy and sanctions, economic warfare. We see the energy front. We as Europeans, we see it really daily. Also grain and food export is included. We see the cyber domain. We do not see it. We feel it sometimes, and we have it on our computers. But it is in place, you can be sure. Propaganda and narratives. Who is responsible for the war? When you listen to African voices, it is the West. Mr. Lavrov is traveling a lot around the world to explain to all the people it is the West who was attacking us as Russia, and we are in a defensive position. Winning narratives is very important on the top level. United Nations, for example, when it comes to new surroundings. Subversion. Now we are looking at Georgia. We are looking at Moldova. subversion is not limited to these countries. It is also happening in our countries. I was really surprised a few months ago when we had immediately 70,000 protesters in the streets of Prague, protesting against the Western sanctions. Can you imagine that it is homegrown? Or can you also imagine that it is supported from outside, to say it this way? I can imagine it is supported from outside. And geopolitics, we will hear it from the president that the geopolitics is the background, the backdrop of all that what is happening here in Ukraine. The Russian side, General Gerasimov, was calling it already in 2013, before the annexation of Crimea. Hybrid warfare means including all elements to put pressure on an opponent. That is hybrid warfare. So some geostrategic aspects, I mentioned it already. We have the big match in the backdrop, democracy against authoritarian systems, as President Biden used to say. And in geostrategic terms, we see already the sanctions are not taken by every country. Sanctions are mostly from Western countries. You have different views on that and different perceptions, as I said already. So we as Europeans and we as part of the Western Hemisphere, we cannot expect that other countries will follow us in our sanctions. They have a different approach to the problem, to the war, and some of them say it is your war. It is not our wars. And don't touch me upon in this regard. Transatlantic partnership, interesting point, because I would say it is reconfirmed in this period. It was not for sure when President Trump was in office. It is now for sure, but we have already a big question mark at the end in 2024. Union State of Russia and Belarus, we have already a move in that direction, I would say. And the big question from me is, how independent will Belarus will be in the future? Will it be already inhalated by Russia? They have already strong confirmations to station nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. So I'm quite interested how Lukashenko will come out of that trap, I would say. Weak international security organizations. Some people are calling for United Nations. You cannot call United Nations if one of the P5 members, Russia, is blocking it and is waging war against another. So isolated, cannot work. What is about OSCE? OSCE was especially established due to the situation during the Cold War. And it was established in order to avoid a war like we see now. It failed. So what will be about the OSCE in the future? What will be about negotiation and mediation? China came up with a 12-point plan. Let us wait and see. I expect also India to come up in order to have more impetus in that, because we cannot expect that the West and Russia will come to a direct solution by having direct talks. And finally, Ukraine, Russia, and EU are more resilient as expected. Not to forget Turkey. I mentioned Turkey because it is very important from the Near East perspective. It is interesting from the North Africa perspective, and it is interesting from our perspective and Ukraine. Just a few words on that. It is southern flank of NATO. It has a special relationship with Russia, with Ukraine too. It's a moderate negotiator. The grain deal strongly goes to the involvement of Turkey. And it is a central power, control power to the entrance to the Black Sea. And it is used by Russia to be an energy hub towards Europe. Highly interesting. And Turkey knows the importance of its own role. Coming back to Ukraine, what is the recent situation? We have the annexation of Ukrainian territory. Is it already a matter of fact for the future? Is it reversible? What can be achieved when the situation on the battleground will change? From a Russian perspective, it is very clear. They see it as Russian territory, and they feel responsible for the defense of that territory and all the people that are living there. A word on refugees and migrants. We should not underestimate the situation, because when of a population of more than 40 million, 8 million flees the country, goes outside, goes abroad. When 5.4 million, I think today it's already 6 million of the people, do not live any longer in their homes. They are internal displaced persons. What can you expect in the future? We will have a total different population of Ukraine. How many people will come back? Can they come back? They lost their houses. They lost everything, so to speak. And now they are in a situation to decide, will we stand in the West or will we go back? We have to start from the crash, from the scratch. So where will we do it? Coming to Europe's landscape, number one, Germany's Chancellor Scholz was calling it Zeitenwende. I would say we're expecting a new Iron Curtain, but now it is longer. It is from the Arctic Sea down to the Black Sea. We have a security dilemma, because all of the Western countries, so all of the European countries now say it's end of peace dividend. We have to invest more in hard security, we have to strengthen NATO, and we have to invest more in our own military and security. What does it mean? More money for the military, a new structure of NATO in Europe, a division of labor may be between NATO and the EU, because it is clear today. Defense is a matter of NATO for the next 10, 20 years. EU as a security actor is not in a strong position. Also, neutral countries like Austria are a little bit challenged, I would say. I had a very interesting discussion today with our former head of state, and you can read it in the Standard on Sunday. So I have to hurry up. Iron Curtain, return of fences, block building, military build-up. And are the core elements what we can expect. We do not know how exactly it will follow the line, but it will be a new Iron Curtain, that's for sure. But it has also impact on NATO and EU enlargement. How to deal with the Western Balkan states, who are not full member, how to deal with Southern Caucasus, Georgia, how to deal with Moldova. So it's on the table. No, it was too fast. No. Let's drink coffee with Mr. Putin. It's okay. Fine. One big question, and some people emphasize that in the last few weeks, I would say. Putin needs the war. He is not waging war. He needs the war in order to stay in power. And if it is the case, that it is not a good indication, I would say, for the future and for ending the war. And when we remember, he always waged wars, beginning in 2000, going through 2008, 14, and so on and so forth. So Putin, if it is the case, it can last very long. And one very important message, I would say, from the European side, we should not say we, the West, has to win a war against Russia. It is about stopping Putin. And it is a war against aggression. It makes a difference from my understanding. The three key factors, finally, what could be a siege for Putin? He needs a win. He needs to win in order not to lose his face and lose his power, finally. How long will the West, and how long and how strong will be the Western support for Ukraine? And how long will the resistance on the Ukraine side will be in place. So that is a bad, unfortunately, confrontation between Russia and Europe, I would say, from a strategic point of view, because we are neighbors. And it will never change. We have to keep it in mind. Yeah. No time for him. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Walter Feichinger. Not a very optimistic, but yet very interesting analysis of the current situation. Moving on from Ukraine to North Africa, Wolfgang Pusztai, freelance security and policy analyst with a special focus on Libya and the Middle East, Northern Africa region. He has both military and academic background and so on. He will deliver his words from over there. He says it's easier to demonstrate on his sheet there. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to talk about kinds of destabilization and conflict in North Africa. I'm going to discuss briefly about worrisome demographic developments, about failed states, about democracy and political Islam, about jihadism and the Wagner mercenaries, and finally about ethnic and religious tensions and the struggle for water, using for each a region or a country as an example. I would like to start with worrying demographic developments, and I will use Egypt as an example. The situation in Egypt is characterized by overpopulation, but by the way, as you can see here on the left side, not only in Egypt. In the year 1980, Egypt had about 42 million inhabitants. The United Nations have predicted in the year 2000 that Egypt will reach 96 million people in 2026. They were slightly off the target, as you can see here. The economic development of Egypt is very challenging. The vast majority of the population, actually 26% of the working force, is employed in the agricultural sector. There is a decrease of arable land every year for desertification, for environment destruction, and so on. The unemployment rate of the youth is at 24%. The unemployment rate of the female youth is at 59%. 59%. Al-Sisi's mega projects, the new capital and the doesn't really work, and the Suez Canal extension project have the main aim to produce jobs for the Egyptians, to produce hundreds of thousands of jobs for the young Egyptians. So he is aware of this problem. Another issue is local energy demands. Egypt has a vast resources with regard to natural gas. They're exporting this, but they could export by far more if the local energy demand would not skyrocket. This is one of the reasons why Egypt needs a lot of foreign investments. Also foreign investments for expanding the production of solar energy. And of course also for expansion of the production of natural gas. The issue is that the vast majority of investments for Egypt comes from the Gulf states. This means Al-Sisi is more or less dependent on the goodwill of the Gulf states. If this is good or bad, that's up to you. The human rights situation in Egypt is quite difficult. Al-Sisi argues this is about the ongoing insurgency of Islamists, of ISIS affiliates on the Sinai Peninsula and of Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in the Nile Delta. So he argues that he needs to be tough on the opposition in order to stay in charge, in order to keep the country calm. I've talked recently with a friend of mine from Egypt, and he said to me, Wolfgang, increasing population is our asset. Look at India, look at China. My point is, there is no way that Egypt can create jobs for 135 million people in 35 and nourish them. No way. Fortunately, President al-Sisi has realized this, and he is considering some steps like a two-child policy or something like this to deal with this. But please keep this issue in mind. A failed state in Libya, in Africa, in Europe's neighborhood, Libya. When a former US president gave his guidance to a newly appointed ambassador on the way to Libya, he said, "Libya is a country of 6 million and has Africa's largest oil reserves. So where is the problem?" If you have a look on the figures from Tunisia, 12 million inhabitants and a by far better situation on the ground. So where is the problem? The current situation in Libya is that the oil production is stable at about 1.2 million barrels per day. This is about 0.5 million barrels below what was the average under Gaddafi, at the end of Gaddafi. The oil revenues are entirely used and spent by the government, by one of the two governments, by the international recognized government in Tripoli. The distribution of the oil revenues is perceived as very uneven. Crime and corruption, up to the highest level of government, are entirely out of control. Smuggling is a huge problem. Maybe you have read in the news that 2.5 tons of uranium ore concentrate, yellow cake, disappeared. I'm not surprised. They have probably sold it somewhere. Smuggling is also a huge problem with regard to fuel. The terrorist organizations in the Sahelzone operate with fuel from Libya, not only with weapons from Libya, not only with ammunition from Libya, but also with fuel from Libya. On the other side, 85% of the workforce are paid for by the government. 85%, including all the militias. Nevertheless, the socioeconomic situation of the population is extremely dire. There is an increasing rift between the East and the West and the North and the South. The security situation is a real challenge. I'm working for companies and I'm writing twice a day security assessments for my clients in Libya. At least once a week, there is a major fighting in the greater Tripoli area with several people getting killed. The last one was in Dajura on Monday. 2 people killed, 6 severely wounded. Libya has a legitimacy problem. It has 2 governments, 2 parliaments, and each of them can argue, we are the parliament, we are the government. There is no rule of law. Courts are making decisions and no one cares. So if you ask me what's the outlook, there won't be elections anytime soon. In 2021, there were no elections because they could not agree who is eligible to run. They still cannot agree about this. I predict that in the year 2030, Libya is either a federation, a very loose federation, or it is broken up. Tunisia. Please compare the figures on the left side and in the center. Please compare some figures about how the situation was in Tunisia just before the revolution and how it is today. And have a look on the risk factors in the year 2009, 2010, and I would like to explain you that the difference today is that they have also the terrorism problem not under control. So many people in Tunisia, especially in the hinterland, are right now worse off than before the revolution. There is one man who realized this, one man who realized that the Ennahda party, the political Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood party in Tunisia, established a state in the state, a deep state. The Ennahda party was the largest party in the Tunisian parliament until President Kais Saied disbanded the parliament. Please be aware, he was elected, and he's a constitutional lawyer, with 73% of the votes, while 55% was the voter turnout. And Saied was initially really supported. He was really supported by the majority of the population. But you've seen in the news that people were out on the streets protesting at the beginning. Those were more or less motivated to go out and protest by some of the guys from the parliament, including the Ennahda, who lost their seats. But right now, after he more or less decided about the new constitution, and after there were elections in December, where the voter turnout was only 11%, the people are really disappointed about him. He's not corrupt in contrast to the Ennahda, but the problem is he is not an expert on economy. And the situation after he is more than 1 year alone in charge does not get better. The situation from the people is actually at least as challenging as it was before. Of course, you cannot expect any kind of wonders of him. But the people are disappointed that there are no quick wins whatsoever. And this brings them back on the roads. So the protests right now on the street are, of course, also facilitated by Ennahda and by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, by the way, deeply hated by most of the Tunisians who are aware that those are the guys who are the most corrupt in the last 10 years. But it's not only about Ennahda anymore. He got also in troubles with the labor union, which was always a backbone of democracy in Tunisia. The question is, how will this develop? Will Tunisia return to democracy? Will the future bring something like what Ennahda calls democracy, so this kind of political Islam democracy that they wanted to establish, or will it bring a presidential one-man show, or will it eventually bring a military coup? We will learn it in the next years. Conflict over the Western Sahara, conflict over territory. I would like to make you aware that since the 11th century, the area of what is today the Western Sahara was controlled and dominated by the people from Morocco, until it became a Spanish colony in the 19th century. Just about 0.5 Sahrawi people are living there. About 70% of the world's phosphate rocks are located in the Western Sahara. And this is maybe of vital significance for Morocco. Morocco is building together with the Emirates a harbor and expanding a harbor in Dakhla, in the south of the Western Sahara. This should be used as a port mainly to export the phosphates from Morocco. Morocco has signed a contract with Nigeria about the Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline project to Europe, which runs through the shallow seas off the coast of the Western Sahara in Morocco. I have some doubts that this project will materialize anytime soon, probably not even in the next 10 years. But nevertheless, it's part of the political discussions and gives some more political weight to Morocco. Another important issue are the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, where Morocco confirmed the right of Israel to be a state and where they made peace with Israel. Quite interesting, in the joint declaration at the beginning of this Abraham Accord signed by the Kingdom of Morocco, it stated, the United States recognizes Moroccan sovereignty over the entire Western Sahara territory. And this was a big political win for Morocco, of course. What does this mean for Europe? That's a good question. You know that Spain is dependent on the goodwill of Morocco with regard to migration. Maybe you don't know that Algeria has an increasing significance with regard to energy production and energy supply to Europe, especially for Italy. Today, 34% of Italy's gas comes from Algeria. That's up from 11%. And on the other side, they have decreased Russian gas in Italy from 47% down to 16%. So if you ask the people in Italy about the Western Sahara, and if you ask the people from Spain about the Western Sahara, you will probably get two different answers. And if you're discussing this in Brussels, and you want to find a common European position, you know the outcome. Jihadists and Wagner in the Sahel region. Several European countries have strategic interests in the region. This was especially the case with regard to the French, who imported from Niger uranium. Up to 80% of the uranium they needed for the nuclear power plants came from Niger, from here up in the north. So the French had vital strategic interests with regard to the Sahel region. Vital strategic interests. There is also, of course, an interest with regard to containing migration and with regard to terrorism. The current situation is that we can see almost every week major terrorist attacks, especially in Mali and in Burkina Faso, and poor performance of the government. Of the governments who were supported mainly by the French in combat. The French who were asking them every day about democracy and human rights. The consequence was, after the military coups, that they turned to Russia. And usually, if you compare European Union training missions with Russian Wagner mercenaries, you can guess who is more efficient. There was a major change recently, and this is also mainly related to the French. The French are now, since about a year, covering only 20% of the uranium needs from Niger. They're getting the vast majority of the uranium right now from Canada, from Kazakhstan, and from Namibia. This means the significance of the Sahelzone for the French is getting down, and they want to decrease from the 20% further on. You know the consequence? Think about the trip of President Macron to Africa just a few weeks ago. They are about to withdraw and to reduce their military engagement in the region. What does this mean for the Russians? Of course, Wagner will stay. Wagner, which is a commercial company, acting in close coordination with the Russian government. And Wagner offers military efficiency, military support, without asking questions about democracy or human rights. The French want to bring in the European Union, especially for the time being in Niger, to replace the French troops in there. Will this work? Finally, I would like to stress what I've discussed with a friend of mine from the Tuareg. He said to me, when we were discussing about terrorists, when I was discussing about terrorists in Mali and in Niger, he said to me, Wolfgang, who is a terrorist? We have young tribal members who are devout Muslims, and they go to Mali to help their brothers. Is he a terrorist? When he is coming back, he's protecting the oil fields in Libya. Is he a terrorist? So, who is a terrorist? Oh, wrong one. Finally, I would like to have a brief look on Ethiopia, about the problem of ethnic tensions with religious some ingredients. The Harrers were the traditionally dominating tribal group in Ethiopia since the 12th century. The second largest behind were the Omoro, the green ones. Together, they had about 60% of the population. They were dominating until 1991, from the 12th century until 1991. In 1991, the Tigray People's Liberation Front had overthrown the Marxist military regime, the bloody Marxist military regime, and the people from Tigray, about 5% of the population, more or less took over the country. Until 2018, until the later Nobel Prize winner, Abiy Ahmed, took over as a prime minister. Abiy Ahmed's father is from the Harrer, and his mother is an Omoro. So he belongs to these two tribal groups. He won the Nobel Prize for reconciliation with Eritrea. In September 2020, a conflict about regional elections in Tigray broke out. The TPLF, the military faction there, made about 95% of the mandates. So, guess how? And the central government didn't want to recognize this. In October 14, the central government tried to establish military control over Tigray. And this triggered a war, which lasted until November 2022. About 20,000 soldiers were killed, but also several hundred thousand civilians were killed. We have still more than 2 million people in the region who face food shortages. We have several hundred thousand IDPs there. We have a peace agreement from November 22, which confirms more or less that the Tigray control their own territory. In between, they were already once close to Addis Ababa, so it seems to be that they are quite good soldiers and fighters. So this was a war, and they are more or less back to stage one. The last point that I would like to mention is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is located about here, in this area. It is the largest hydroelectric power plant in Africa. The filling of the reservoir is ongoing since July 2020, and the Egyptians and the Sudanese are furious about it. It is still not clarified what will be the precise impact of this dam on the water supply of Sudan and of Egypt. Both countries, who are certainly not the best friends, conducted last year Air Force exercises practicing strikes on strategic targets. Guess what they were meaning? I doubt that they will blow up the dam. You can imagine what would be the outcome. But nevertheless, this great Ethiopian Renaissance dam is certainly an issue to be taken into account. A friend of mine, a guy from Ethiopia that I've met a couple of weeks ago in Washington, said to me, when we were discussing about the dam, hey, so what? That's our water. We can do with it whatever we want. If you have this perception, you know the outcome. So, brings me back to what was recently ahead of Al-Ahram Online. Egypt's population is expected to reach 157 million. 157 million in 2050. We will have lots of fun with it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Another add to our depression of the evening. Gudrun Harrer, leading journalist of the Austrian newspaper Der Standard, distinguished expert on Middle East. She will now analyze the situation in the Middle East for us. Gudrun Harrer, please. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I have the right glasses here. The Middle East in 15 minutes, it's really no simple enterprise. And of course, we are talking of single countries with very different parameters. However, there are many developments which are linked. I will not proceed country by country, but start with the breaking news from last week. The resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, mediated by China and signed in China, which could, I stress could, be a game changer in the region. I'll take it as a point of reference to move into different directions, and I hope you'll bear with me and you follow me, and I also took some notes because the paths are very complicated. On geopolitical level, China, which was up to now merely an economic giant in the region, enters now Middle Eastern policy and does it really with a big bang. Russia had used the war in Syria to come back as a player to the region, and it will remain. However, the war in Ukraine binds a lot of resources and political energy of Russia, and this means new space for China, and I think we definitely will see more of it. Looking at Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's almost exactly 20 years ago that the US gave up its policy of double containment of Iraq and Iran. They toppled Saddam Hussein, and they liberated, in fact, not only Iraq, but also Iran from the Iraqi dictator. The single most important outcome of the US-led intervention in Iraq was really the rise of Iran to a regional power, with many consequences. Like, for example, the new radicalization wave in the Sunni jihadist sector. I mean, of course, we know the most dramatic being the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. But generally today, it's hard to find a conflict in the region which is not influenced by the hegemonic competition between Iran and the Arabs. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, also Lebanon are paying high prices. With an Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, these countries could hope for some slowdown of its internal conflicts and for renewed consensus-fighting efforts, like in Lebanon, for example, where momentarily it's even impossible to elect a president and to move Lebanon away from the economic abyss. However, let's see who prevails, which group, and who gives in, because it still has to happen. A big achievement, of course, would be the end of the war in Yemen, where the UN brokered ceasefire has expired last October, but still holds in a way. However, realistically, even if we have this ceasefire, no real political solution is in sight, nowhere. Iran-Saudi talks were facilitated by Iraq and by Oman, and they were going on for some time. Almost no one expected them to succeed without any solution for the urgent nuclear crisis with Iran. Instead, in the midst of fears that Iran is escalating its uranium enrichment program, comes this successful Chinese mediation. You will have heard traces of almost weapon-grade uranium have been found by the IAEA in Iran. It doesn't mean there is production, but they have found something. So China is a very strong advocate for a renewal of the Vienna nuclear deal of 2015 for the JCPOA, for economic, but also for strategic reasons. And obviously they convinced Saudi Arabia that if it invests in normalization now, it will get something. Let's see. The nice effect, side effect for Saudi strongman Mohammed bin Salman is to show President Joe Biden that Saudi Arabia has given up on the US as the one and only ally of Saudi Arabia. Also, the Saudi relations to Russia are very good, by the way, with cooperation in OPEC Plus at the Western expense oil prices. The Saudis feel treated very badly by Washington, not only because of Biden's finger pointing in the Khashoggi affair, but the deterioration dates back to Barack Obama's support for the so-called Arab Spring and the ouster of President Mubarak in 2011. The Saudis never forgave that. In brackets, because also it was mentioned, none of the old US partners in the region have fully taken the Western side regarding the Russian war against Ukraine. Nobody. Also, Israel did not join the sanction regime or provide weapons to Kiev. In the case of Israel, the reasons are very simple. Russia, in a way, is Israel's neighbor. In Syria, Israel depends on Russian tolerance if it wants to carry out military strikes, military actions against Iran-related targets in Syria, including, for example, Hezbollah. But by improving relations with Iran, the Saudis have a message for Israel too. Lately, there was new speculation about the possible open, there are already covered Israeli military strikes against Iranian nuclear sites. But the Saudis urgently want to get out of a war they are trapped in Yemen, and are afraid of a new regional escalation. They would be the first victims of retaliation by Iranian proxy groups. They have been through that during the last years. Remember the Houthi attacks on Aramco sites, very substantial attacks with substantial damages in 2021. And there have been attacks also on the United Arab Emirates, which means that Israel's plans for a clear Israeli-Arab front against Iran have failed to a certain point for now. But although it caused a lot of discussion in Israel now during the last days, and the Israeli-Saudi relations are not as good as they used to be, I would not overemphasize this. The United Arab Emirates has been the first country which committed to the Abraham Accords, which were mentioned here, for open cooperation with Israel in 2020. And since then, the Emirates have strongly invested in its security ties with Tehran. And by the way, the Emirates are also the driver for normalization with Syria's Assad. I think the military defense posture of Saudi Arabia will not change 1 centimeter for now. The Saudis also will continue to make big business with the US. I mean, perhaps you heard on Wednesday about the huge Boeing Dreamliner deal with the United States. It will, or with Boeing, it will continue to buy US weapons and will continue to build its military capacity, as also Iran will continue to invest in its missile program and also in its regional policy, which will remain contested. Saudi Arabia, because this is all an important question, joining the Abraham Accords is hard to imagine, of course, as long as the further deterioration of Israeli-Palestinian relations will go on like it is now. But it's not off the table, I would say, especially when the aforementioned Mohammed bin Salman becomes king. With, as you know, the escalation in the West Bank and new terrorism in Israel, this conflict has re-entered the stage. It was on the back burner for years, also due on the focus on Iran. And the situation now is worrying, to say the least. In this context, also having alluded to Mohammed bin Salman and the king and the succession questions in Saudi Arabia, of course, also within the Palestinian leadership, we are in a transition period. Even if I cannot see any serious political attempts to prepare it, transition looms in the Islamic Republic of Iran too. The Raisi government was installed by the religious leader to prepare the country for the post-Khamenei era, but mismanaged it. And the most visible result is the feminist revolutionary movement, which unfortunately, however, has not brought the results wished for by its supporters. Iran's economic problems have contributed to the agreement with Saudi Arabia, and here we are back with China. Beijing in 2021 has already concluded a 25 years strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran, which will not bear fruits if Iran remains isolated, if the isolation grows or stays. And China really has shown quite openly its dissatisfaction with Iran during President Xi's visit in Saudi Arabia last December. So they really pressure Iran to do something on the nuclear side. As I said, the outcome is completely open. There is no guarantee whatsoever that it will develop. If it does develop, it's not excluded, and I allow myself to go to North Africa for a moment. It's not excluded that Egypt will join the deal sooner or later, which would really be a hard blow for Israel. Egypt, by the way, is also not only an important player, but also receptive to Chinese economic incentives and needs investment, as we have heard. But I want to mention one very interesting development, which is an open question, I mean, also for the Middle East, because Egypt is an African country, but a very important Arab player. Will the Egyptian government be willing and able to implement the requests by the International Monetary Fund for new loans, I mean, which is create transparency and equal opportunities and halt unnecessary mega projects? The IMF is requesting this. I mean, what President Sisi needs for jobs. All of that would come at the expense of the largest entrepreneur in Egypt, the army. And what's really interesting, will the army concur with President Sisi if he tries to do something? If not, if President Sisi loses the support of the army, what can happen? The revolts of 2011 exacerbated the split between conservative Arab monarchies and Muslim Brotherhood republicanism. However, this period seems to be coming to an end, and it's quite interesting. The reconciliation between Turkey and Qatar on one side and United Arab Emirates and Saudis and even Egypt on the other would have seemed unthinkable 2-3 years ago. Even more surprising Erdogan's open attempts to restore relations to Damascus. Remember, Assad was one of the first guys who said Assad has to go. No? And now we are this was one of the reasons why Assad was in Moscow meeting Putin now. No? And of course, it would come at the expense of the Kurds in the north of Syria, who are our guardians against the Islamic State, a fact we also should appreciate more. We will see how Erdogan survives the elections in May. He has lost much of his popularity, but the situation in the territories hit by the earthquake could even help him. I think so. If he succeeds in getting the people, the right people to vote, the people who vote for him, I mean, he's preparing the voters' lists and so on. I mean, but if this happens, it will increase tensions. I mean, I used to say, as long as he's here, I don't speculate that he will go. One winner of the terrible earthquake for sure is Assad. I mentioned it already. It seems to accelerate his rehabilitation in the Arab world. During the days after the catastrophe, one Arab foreign minister after the other landed in Damascus, and he himself was invited for the first time also to Oman. I come to the end. As you can see, we could spin a never-ending thread through the region. I have limited myself to classical security, politics, and questions and not talked about people, so only 3 sentences. I have not talked about the economic fallout, also caused by the Ukraine war, the lack and the growing costs of foodstuff and energy, which are life-threatening for many, and even, of course, also nourish new migration worries in Europe. Another huge question for the future are the consequences of climate change, drought, unbearable temperatures, desertification. And unfortunately, I would also predict that the destitution after the earthquake, the growing misery of the people, but also the new possible security arrangements between Saudi Arabia and Iran will reinforce autocratic rule in the region. Freedom and democracy are nowhere in sight, and it hurts especially to say this after the terrible news, new human rights reports coming from Iran, for example, today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Harrer. Again, no good reasons for optimism. You talked already a lot about China. China becoming a major player everywhere, obviously, in the world. It's extending its influence all over the world. So, last but not least, Dr. Werner Fasslabend, former Minister for Defense and President of the IEES, on East Asia.
I know it's a lot of information you are confronted with, and I will try to add a little bit more. I will concentrate on the security situation in Eastern Asia, which means this arc of crisis in East Asia comprising North Korea, Taiwan, and South China Sea. What is interesting that this is between the North Korea, and the Spratly Islands in South China Sea, a distance of about 5,000 kilometers. Insofar, you have to think in different dimensions than in Europe. If we look, what is the specific issue in this arc of crisis, you have to say it is the global power confrontation which makes it different to any other situation all over the globe. Because this is the confrontation between number 1, number 2, number 3, number 6, and number 8 in the military sense. It's also the confrontation between the 3 biggest economic powers, America, China, and Japan, and then in addition also the influence of South Korea and others. And it's not only a confrontation between the biggest powers, but a very significant point is that it is also the combination of national security, national interest, and at the same time also of global rivalry, which means it's not only the question of the security of the countries themselves, but also the battle, the fight for the #1 position in the world. If we look now what is behind it, this is the picture of more or less the American security strategy. US always had a classical counter-rim strategy, which means when you are surrounded by water, then you try to secure the coast at the other side. This was the reason for founding NATO at the Atlantic counter coast, and this was the reason also for shaping alliances with this belt of islands and peninsulas at the Pacific side, because it was not possible to secure the territory because it was occupied by Russia and China itself. And this is insofar interesting because behind it is the most traumatic experience America had in its history. This is Pearl Harbor. For them, it was more or less the first time that the country immediately was endangered, and this brought them to this system, you know, to shape this belt of security at the other side. And only if you understand this, then you know the specific relationship, for example, between United States and Japan, or South Korea, or Taiwan, and also the Philippines. If we compare it with China's global strategy, you have to say China always had more or less a terrestrial strategy. But I am going to the next picture. Due to the fact that China is the most important exporter and importer of the world, and due to the fact that around about 90% of all the good transports go by sea, China had to become also a maritime power, and a maritime, it had to develop a maritime strategy. And of course, this was more or less also the main reason for developing the Belt and Road Initiative, which means trying to shape a strategy from the Pacific Ocean around the Indian Ocean towards Africa and Europe at the other side. But this strategy also, because China always was thinking territorially, also brought them to shape two corridors, the Pakistan corridor and the Myanmar or Burma corridor. And this means, if you look to the picture as a whole, that by this strategy, there resulted more or less a containment, a strategic containment of India. And this brought India for the first time also, at least in the maritime dimension, at the other side. Yeah, when we are asking what are China's strategic priorities, you have to say, first of all, it's overtake Taiwan. Second, it's dominate the South China Sea. Third, it is to expel the United States from the Korean Peninsula. This is the only place where the United States has a basis on the East Asian continent. And fourth of it, it is the control of the Western Pacific, which means more or less shaping for the future a sort of a dimension of an East Asian ocean. And those four dimensions of their strategy, of their strategic priorities, of course, are encountering the American interests and the American strategies. If we go to the next picture, and we go now into these three places, South China Sea, Taiwan, and Korea. This is the picture of South China Sea. You can see China is claiming around about 90% of the South China Sea as their territorial waters. And this would mean as an effect, of course, that they will get a central position, a central strategic position within Southeast Asia. And because Southeast Asia is the link between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, this will be decisive for ruling, for dominating the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and this will mean the one who rules the Indo-Pacific Ocean will rule the world. And insofar, it is not only the combination of a terrestric with a maritime strategy, but it is also more or less the basis for the future rule of the world. Yeah, if we look at the situation now, how far or what has developed in the last periods, you have to say, China was successful in more or less shaping already a structure within the South China Sea with only 4 islands, as you can see here. They are able to control already more or less the Philippines, Vietnam, and parts of Indonesia. And therefore, the militarization of the South China Sea, of course, is a very important factor. It is against a judgment of the Court of the United Nations, but China never accepted this. And the counter strategy of the Western side is, of course, especially from the American side, to send ships anytime, in order to make sure that free navigation in the South China Sea will be necessary and will be or should be a fact also in the future. If we look now what has happened in the last years, then you can see, there are 2 maps. The left one just shows the targeted survey of the South China Sea. And you can see here, by this intense survey and control actions, how systemically this survey is made by China. And on the other side, you can see also at the right side, that, okay, they try to fill in the whole space within the 9-dash line, as it is called, from China. And insofar, you can say, they are constantly increasing their survey from year to year, but generally, you also could say, in the last year, this was not an extraordinary situation. Nothing spectacular happened. Absolutely different to the situation in Taiwan. Taiwan, certainly, the last year was a year of escalation. China always tried already in the last years, to enter, for example, the air identification zone from Taiwan, or they also crossed the median line between mainland China and Taiwan, but these were minor incidents. But this year, for the first time, there was more or less an invasion exercise. What you can see here is, those red points. Those were the regions that China declared as fire exercise areas for a certain period, where it was not allowed for anybody else to go in without having the danger also to get under fire. This was the point. What was the reason for it? The reason for it was this escalation point of point. As I said, you know, there was always a rising, there were rising incidents, but nothing spectacular. And then it was a Czech delegation that for the first time, also with the President of Parliament, visited Taiwan, and China reacted harshly. But it came more when Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of the United States, visited Taiwan. China reacted not only harshly, but with this exercise of invasion, the first time that they made a really absolutely professional combined exercise for naval and air forces, and at the same also terrestrial forces. What was the reaction from the other side? Biden declared, we will defend Taiwan. And the reaction just last week was, you know, another escalation from the Chinese side. When you look at the words the new foreign minister, Xi Gang, uttered, he spoke about conflict and confrontation, and it also was backed by President Xi. So you can see we came very close, you know, to a situation where really both sides are looking at each other and not only observing, but thinking further on. And it's quite interesting that we have on the one side this situation of a real war game from the China side. And for the first time also, at least in public, we also have war games from the American side. It was an American think tank that produced these war games about an invasion, possible invasion of Taiwan, reaction from America together with Japan, and what would be the outcome. Okay, if we look at the outcome, I do not go into details here, but it would mean a really horrible situation. Losses of airplanes, fighter aircraft, hundreds of them for Japan and for America, hundreds of them of ships for China. And the situation that both armies certainly would get into an extremely serious situation. And this is where we are. We are in the situation that both sides already are producing war games. And this means for me, it has become a situation that has to be taken seriously. It's not just a claim or whatever, but it has arisen in a way that nobody thought before. And if I just look, you know, what are experts from countries out of the region talking about it, I only can say Australian experts who are not so immediately confronted with the situation think that, well, the possibility for a war will be within 3 to 6 years, maybe. And insofar, it is a realistic danger that we are confronted with. Okay, I just will try to go to the last big region. This is the Korean Peninsula. I do not go into details, but it just shows, you know, the one who will dominate Korea also can, of course, block the Yellow Sea due to the geostrategic situation of Korea as the link between China and Japan. And this would mean, of course, you know, the red dot more or less is symbolizing the possibility that the Chinese would overtake it, or the blue ones is the Americans, and you can see that this would have a serious effect for any side. Of course, this is also, in addition, strengthened the situation by North Korea's missile and nuclear capabilities. And you have to say they are developing rapidly new types with longer range and higher capabilities. And we have the factor that, of course, President Kim of North Korea probably is one of the least calculable personalities in the world. Last, almost last but not least, is what is the situation from the Japanese side. Japan has 4 open strategic questions. This is the Kuril Islands. This is north of the Japanese islands that did belong to Japan, and after World War was overtaken by Russia. They were very close before the Ukrainian war to find a solution, but this has ended now. It is, of course, the North Korean question over here, because Japan is immediately endangered by it. It is the Senkaku question. This is a group of islands that is controlled by Japan, but it's also claimed by China. And of course, it's also the question of securing this route through the Strait of Taiwan and the South China Sea, because this is absolutely vital also for Japanese interests, because they are absolutely dependent also on exports and imports, just in the same way as China or South Korea. So I come to the last question, to the last picture. Last picture just shows what has happened also in this last 1 or 2 years. It is the quadrilateral security dialogue, the so-called Quad, which means cooperation between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia in order to get control of rising China. And this certainly will be one of the most important factors, because America alone will not be able to answer due to the huge distance between United States, geographic distance, and China or the islands in the Western Pacific on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, this de facto alliance between Beijing and Moscow is the answer from the other side. And this certainly will be a very strong factor for the future. Very last picture that I want to show is, you know, in a military strategy, you always have a calculation about this triangle between power, space, and time. And what we can tell here is, you know, the space is defined. National interest, especially in Taiwan, second, South China Sea, third, South Korea. What is not defined yet is power and time. Power will be defined very immediately in the coming years. Everybody is investing a lot. China, America, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, everybody. And the last question will be, what should be the right moment to act in the one or in the other way? And this will be open to the considerations and also to the upbuilding of power between the big powers of the world. And insofar, this is not a very positive picture where we can make of this situation. But what we have to say, if we try to look at it realistically, then we have to be aware this probably will define global politics in the coming years to an extent. Nobody can tell what the next president will do. Nobody can tell what will be the relative power situations and the estimates. Nobody can tell whether the president from the one or the other side will be ready, you know, to go into very hard and very immense losses, really immense losses. And insofar, there will be also the hope that a conflict can be just not be realized, let me say it this way. But okay, the future will show it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Werner Fasslabend. Well, we heard a lot of not really optimistic things. The clock is quite advanced. We should be finished by 8:30. Just a short question to each of you from my side, and then, ladies and gentlemen, you're invited to ask questions to our distinguished guests. Mr. Feichtinger, you said both sides are too strong to fail and too weak to win, and Putin needs the war. Do you see any chance Putin could be ousted in the next, let's say, 6 months? And should we really hope for it?
I see no sign for that. He has a strong support from the Russian side, if you listen to the media reports and so on. And he has prepared for that situation, yeah? To get the media under control, to wipe out the NGOs, and so on and so forth, and to foster his own suppression apparatus. So he was preparing for that war in many dimensions, and now we see the result. He is not endangered from inside, I would say, and all the oligarchs and so on, they are highly connected with him. If Putin fails, they also will fail, so they have to support him. So no hope for that, from my understanding, in the next half year.
Mr. Pusztai, you described very impressively the situation, especially the situation in Egypt, the population development in Egypt, and the growing influence of Russia and China in Africa. Does Europe, from your point of view, pay enough interest into North Africa, or is Europe neglecting Africa?
Well, I would say it's not coordinated enough. The problem is that the European Union spends a huge amount on Africa, on development projects, on this and that, but it's not really focused and it's not really well coordinated. I've discussed in Brussels several times at the level of the Secretary Generals about the strategy for the stabilization of Africa, and I've also supported the European People's Party with regard to developing a document about this. From my point of view, it is crucial to have a sound strategy about how to stabilize Africa. And this means a three-layered strategy. It was on my last slide. The layer one would be to contain the multipliers of destabilization and to improve good governance. The multipliers are, of course, I've talked about it, the demographic developments. To achieve a progress on environmental protection. I'm not a member of the Green Party, but nevertheless, to develop some progress on environmental protection. To minimize corruption and to cultivate good governance. If you are not getting demographic developments under control, you can forget about it. If there is some kind of progress at this layer, it is necessary to dig down into the second layer to achieve a broad impact. This means to implement the most important and most urgent measures for stabilization and to deal with the key problems in the social, economic, security and human rights sector. One example, it's necessary not to establish high-end hospitals. It's important to develop primary care for everyone. And only in the third level you could dig into peak performance, which means high-end universities, high-end industry, and so on and so on. So the issue is there needs to be a sound strategy on how to stabilize Africa, how to deal with migration. Unfortunately, there is lots of talk about this, but no coordinated action whatsoever.
Mrs. Harrer, obviously the most important event of the past weeks and months was the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Should we more see it as a threat or as a chance?
Well, I mean, it depends a little bit on the perspective. The one positive outcome, as I mentioned, could be that some internal conflicts in certain countries are slowing down. I mean, for example, let's look at Lebanon, because it's never in the headlines. I mean, it's a country really on the verge of breakdown for a long time. They are not even able to elect a president, to find a new prime minister, because there is no consensus between the proxies of Iran and the groups who are looking at Riyadh. No? So there could be some movement. Also in Yemen, this war has to stop. I don't think there will be a political solution, but there will also be no military solution. So we could see some progress. But as I mentioned also, on the security side, I mean, if Saudi Arabia and Iran make a deal together, I mean, it's not good news for democracy movements in the region, of course. I mean, regarding Israel, also it depends. Of course, Israel has an interest in de-escalation on the nuclear file in Iran. Of course, they did not like the Vienna nuclear deal of 2015, and Trump exited it in 2018. But since then, we don't move. I mean, it's getting worse and worse. As I said, it's a real threat of total escalation of the Iranian uranium enrichment program. And it's good news if there is some halt in it. I mean, we need to restart it. And I find it very interesting that China could convince, obviously, Saudi Arabia that if they invest now in ties, perhaps there could be some progress made, but it's completely open. I mean, there have also been other Saudi-Iranian agreements. One on cooperation, I think it was in the 90s, 98. One other in 2001. It was already on security, and nothing happened. No? So I don't know.
Mr. Fasslabend, recently I visited with you in your institute. We talked to the ambassador of Singapore, and he said the real red line for China is declaration of independence by Taiwan, and so far the Americans avented that. They were convinced the Taiwanese not to do it. What is your perspective? Will they do it?
Yeah, from the Chinese side, you have to say it's not only national interests. Of course, they claim that Taiwan should be reunited with China because it was part of China, at least for some periods. But you also have to be aware, this is the last moment also for the Communist Party where they were not successful, because you always have to be aware that Chiang Kai-shek, this was the opponent of Mao Zedong, you know, who governed as prime minister or as president China before. He had to flee at Taiwan, and he established the Republic of Taiwan. And insofar, for the nowadays government in China, this is not only a question of national interest, but also of more or less resolving the rest of the communist revolution and the rest of the communist overtaking of the country. And this makes it, of course, very, very specific.
Well, thank you very much. The floor is open to your questions. The lady will come with the microphone. I ask you for real questions, not for co-metaphors. A Botschafter, Ambassador, first row, and then to yourself, please. And if you could tell to whom you put the question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to very briefly touch on the political strategy of the West towards Ukraine. I think the time has come to fundamentally rethink the Western position. We do remember that, rightly so and legitimately so, the West has said it is solely and exclusively up to the Ukraine to decide their own fate. I think no longer. We have passed this point. without a massive political political pressure on both sides, both on Russia and Ukraine, and at the same time to develop perhaps publicly, which hasn't been done yet, publicly elements of an arrangement, of a political arrangement, it will get us nowhere if we don't do that. And the two important elements would be for Putin to save his face and for Zelensky to stay in power. And finally, what Walter Feichtinger said, I'm not sure it's correct that Putin needs the war. I mean, I don't think he is in danger of losing his power. But anyway, this is a side effect. So the important thing is, and I repeat, the Western side has to rethink its strategy and towards political strategy towards Ukraine. Thank you.
Would somebody like to comment on it, Mr. Feichting?
Yes, of course. On a strategic level, I would say the final decision on the intensity of defense of Ukraine lies in Washington. So it is in their hands, so to speak.
If I may very briefly with regard to this, fully agree 100%. The issue is there needs to be a solution which ensures for the West that this is not a victory of Russia. And number two, it needs to ensure that the Russian regime, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't get overthrown because of a defeat. One solution could be, and I'm discussing this with some American friends right now, we are writing a paper about this for someone, could be maybe a demilitarization of the area. This means a demilitarization, either of what was occupied since the beginning of the war, or preferably a demilitarization of the whole area, maybe even including the Crimean Peninsula. And this demilitarized zone would need to be monitored by an international peacekeeping force. India could take charge of this. So we would need countries which have a military substantial power and who are respected by both sides. And last but not least, keep in mind the Saarland governance after the World War. There could be, or there should be, an international administration for this area. Yes and no. This would be a very new, a very spectacular approach. But to be honest, as I said before, I fully agree with you. This will lead to nowhere, for no one, and also not for the Europeans.
Please. A question, please. Huh?
Yes. So I have a short question to each presenter. So at first, Mr. Feichtinger, so do you believe so? How influence the situation in Ukraine or the process of the war in Ukraine on the situation in Western Balkans? And the second question is to Mr. Pusztai and Ms. Harrer. So do you believe in the long run can Russia keep his presence or influence in Sahel region and in Syria, because Russia is now losing so many personal or financial and material resources? And the last short question is to Mr. Fasslabend. How important Russia in the great power game in East Asia or Far East? So do you believe so? Can Russia still play some role, or Russia is so indifferent or in the shadow of China? Thank you very much.
Well, got a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Maybe briefly.
Coming to the Western Balkans, it is for sure that Russia has a strong impact, mainly on Serbia and Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it is known by everyone. And it is a dilemma for the countries nowadays because they have a strong economic support from EU and they have a strong relationship with Russia that has not such a strong impact, I would say. And the science today, I would say, is going that the decision is coming that the countries focus more on Europe than on Russia. That is what I expect.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question because if you remember, I referred to the unexpected Turkish rapprochement to Assad in Damascus, which is heavily pushed for by Moscow. And of course, there are reasons for it, because Russia needs to find finally a solution for Syria. I mean, they are pushing also for a constitutional process. They have the famous Astana format with Iran and Turkey. But until now, nothing moved. But of course, they have every interest to find some kind of political solution, to be able to relax a little bit in Syria. But I don't think they will leave it. I really think they are, I mean, it was their last foothold in the Middle East. They came back. It was an enormous chance for them in 2015 to come back. Don't forget, I mean, they leased the port in Tartus for I don't know how many, 90 years or something. So they really are there also militarily, and by the way, they also have huge influence in Egypt, and they will not give it up. And also, as I mentioned, they played their cards very well also with the Arab Gulf countries. I mean, of course, for Saudi Arabia, it's perhaps also something personal with Biden, but in OPEC Plus, they really, I mean, at Western expense, no? They are there.
Briefly.
With regards to Russia and Africa, I would like to say, at first it's necessary to realize what are the strategic objectives of the Russian with regard to Africa. I would like to name two. One is the economic interest to exploit the resources of Africa and to have Africa as an economic partner. And the second one is to contain or at least limit the influence of the West there. Which tools do they have available? They have a diplomatic instrument of state power, which has some impact in Africa. I would say you've mentioned the Lavrov trips. They have a very limited military instrument of power down there. We are talking about Wagner. This means we are talking about infantry and a couple of helicopters. That's no match, even to the French. We are talking about the limited economic instruments. The Russians don't have the technical capabilities. They don't have the money to fund major programs down there. But, for example, in Egypt, they want to build a nuclear power plant together. So it's limited. It's not nil, but it's limited. If we talk about the informational instrument and the sticky power of Russia, I guess you know the answer. So altogether, I would say the possibilities of Russia, with some exceptions, are limited to influence something in Africa.
Yeah, the question whether Russia can influence the strategic situation in East Asia heavily, I would say not directly. In an indirect way, of course, they can do a lot. They cannot do it directly because they have very weak naval forces, and insofar they do common exercises together with China and also others, but this is not really substantial. What really they can do in an alliance is, of course, on the one hand, to provide China with the necessary political backing, with the backing of resources in any kind. Also, maybe, to start a smaller conflict anywhere else that could bind Western forces in such a case. And of course, they are also backing China on the political stage. One must not underestimate Russian skills. They do have, especially in the so-called third world, in Africa, in Latin America, and also in some Asian states, where Russia is quite successfully working on the theory, okay, the West is working with double standard and so on. This is not real, and the other world will be more or less the rising world. The West is in decline, and insofar one must not underestimate it. I would not overestimate it. Certainly no direct result of this backing, but on the other hand, not to underestimate it, what they can do on the overall scene.
May I add something to what Wolfgang Pusztai said, something very interesting, the nuclear power question in the Middle East, and that Russia is starting to build a nuclear power plant for Egypt. And it's interesting to see that there could even be a kind of competition of China and Russia in the Middle East, because one of the reasons for Saudi Arabia to join this, to follow the Chinese wish to have this agreement restoring diplomatic relations with Iran, they are also highly frustrated that the United States are not helping them build nuclear capacities. I mean, not nuclear weapon capacities, but nuclear power. No? Because the United States always try to put a brake on this. No? And so also Chinese were heavily involved in the implementation of the nuclear deal in Iran. So also China is interested in nuclear deals, perhaps, in the Middle East.
Please.
Wolfgang Helper, I would have a question to Mr. Fasslabend. You showed a slide on the possible outcome of a wargaming exercise of conflict between the United States and China. And if I read that slide correctly, it shows that American losses of aircraft and ships outnumber the Chinese respective losses by an extraordinary margin. And this I found striking, and how come?
I think what CSIS, this is the institution, did was not only very professional, but also very substantial. They had, I think, 24 scenarios. They tried, also from lessons from the past, from the invasion in Normandy in World War II until the Falkland Islands and so on, to find out some scenarios. How can it happen? How will it happen? And of course, you have to be aware, For the Americans, they are far away. They only can act out of their bases in Okinawa, in Guam, and other places. Insofar, they will have big, heavy losses with aircraft. This is more or less a need. And there is even the proposal for them, that America should produce not so many stealth fighter, but rather a bigger number of simple fighter aircraft in order to have enough capability to go into the region. And of course, on the other hand, for the Chinese, they have to make this invasion with boats from the mainland and try to enter Taiwan. And they can be sure that there will be quite some resistance, that Taiwan is prepared. And this will mean, that they will have heavy losses, and also from the air, because also from a further distance, you can easily hit a ship, a boat, much easier than to hit an airplane. And this makes a difference. For the first time when I saw the results, I also was very surprised about, the number and so on. But if you try to occupy yourself a little bit more, then you can see this is quite professional analysis about the possible warfare, the way it could happen. Please.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the AAES and the panelists for such an interesting discussion. Thank you very much. My name is Michael Thake. My first question goes to Dr. Harrer and Magister Pusztai. So we've came to this new geopolitical reality. We're seeing more or less the arrival of realpolitik, extremely densely clustered, alliances based on relative gain, and also new enemies being formed. within the Middle East. And we're seeing the disintegration of Lebanon, maybe possible isolation of Syria, etc., etc. And especially we have stagflation issues, instability of the economy. Excuse me. And my question is, like, aren't we living in a 2011 Arab Spring redux to a certain extent? Is there a possibility that rebellions will occur within the next year? And if so, which country do you think would have rebellion first? And thank you.
Later. Yeah, please.
I think everybody is it's very well prepared, much better prepared than 2011. And if you compare the Sisi government, the Sisi regime with the Mubarak regime, we were really in liberal times at that time. I would really say this is also why I mentioned the army, because the army got during the last 10 years much more power in Egypt, and I think this is. It was already the factor in 2011 for Mubarak. I mean, it was the army saying, okay, it's enough. No? But for Sisi, if he fulfills these conditions of the IMF, it could become a danger. For the rest of the populations, I really don't think so. Don't forget, I mean, the wars in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, nowhere it's really over. Stability has even more value than 2011. I mean, also populations without war, like in Egypt, they were really exhausted in 2013, 2015, 14, and they said, what's all this liberal democracy for us if we cannot send our children to school? So, and people are really suffering. They are on the verge of dying in some countries. I mean, the expensive food stuff. And you mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon is, I don't know how they survive. So I don't really see any really reserves for a new Arab Spring.
Madam.
Thank you very much. My question is directed to Mr. Pusztai. You mentioned the Indians as being possible Peace Corps people in this case. They are too light or too heavy hedges in regard to Russia. They could not be put there. Second question, North and South Africa. How does the division of labor between China and Russia differentiate between your belt you are discussing and South Africa? Thank you.
I apologize, I'm just overcoming a corona infection, so could you please repeat your question? I'm not fully...
the microphone is gone. It was...
I said the division, what is the differentiation? How would you differentiate between Russians and Chinese in your sphere of work in the northern area of South Africa and South Africa? Is there a division of labor which is very parallel or is it very different?
Got it,
Thank
sorry
you.
for...
And the other was the caveat on India. Thank you.
Got it. What's the difference of the Russian and the Chinese approach? Well, there is a huge difference because China has the funds available. China has the money available. China has the assets available. China is bringing in their own labor force. Russia doesn't have these financial capacities. Russia doesn't have the workforce, the skilled workforce that they could bring in. This means Russia is pursuing in the countries like in Libya or in the Central African Republic or in Mali a more military strategy by using the Wagner mercenaries to get some influence. In countries where it is possible, like in Egypt, they're using their technological skills with regard, for example, for nuclear power plants. In Algeria, they are using also their skills also with regard to the oil industry. They have also to offer quite a lot of this. The Chinese approach is a much wider one, but they are not relying on military other than the base in Djibouti or something like this. They are relying more on the economic power of the state.
And South Africa. South Africa.
Well, South Africa is, I would say, is a country which is which has many challenges. It has challenges in itself, as you know, it's not as stable as before. because of a huge amount of corruption, huge amount of crime, because of the situation, the internal situation in South Africa. Nevertheless, if we have a look on the southern part of Africa, South Africa is certainly the most stable one, and the country which is the only one to be able to intervene with military and with economic means in other countries. So yes, I foresee a role for South Africa in the stabilization of the southern part of Africa. Hopefully, they will assume it.
Sir.
Thank you. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Khaled Minshawi. I'm a consular at the Egyptian embassy. And hearing Egypt mentioned several times, I tried as much as I can to wait till everybody asks these questions so that I don't hijack the discussion. First, I would like to thank the Academy and the Institute for organizing such important seminar and having such esteemed panelists. Highly appreciated. Allow me to just comment, if I may, regarding some of the things that were
Please, briefly.
Yes, of course. But if you allow me, I would stay
sure.
for hours. But
yeah.
just I will start with the comment regarding the GERD, or the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Being the deputy ambassador in Ethiopia in 2022, I was a witness of what's going on there regarding the GERD. And what is mentioned by our Ethiopian friend, that it's our water, we can do whatever we want, it's unfortunately real. And it contradicts with the international law in this regard. This is a transboundary water course. It has to be respected and abide. All the riparian countries have to respect their obligations vis-a-vis international law in this regard. And I will give one example in this, or one fact in this regard. The water, the rains that comes on the Ethiopian lands per year is 934 billion cubic meter. 934 billion cubic meter. Egypt's share is 55 billion cubic meter. So at the ratio, you can imagine. And by the way, the 55%, the 55
Sir,
billion
it's
cubic.
very interesting. I'm sorry, we can't.
Moving to another point, I'm really sorry, but regarding the role of the army in Egypt, definitely the army is playing a very patriotic role in Egypt. It's not only that they had ousted the former President Mubarak, but they had given the power to the democratically elected president, former President Morsi, and the current President El Sisi. So, and they are supporting the will of the Egyptian people rather than the will of the president himself. Unfortunately, Egypt is...
Final point, please.
Final point. There are a lot of points, and
yeah, sorry, we all could talk for hours on all topics.
The most important thing for me that I may share, you may notice, all the audience, that how important Egypt is. How important Egypt is, from what was mentioned by the esteemed panelists, how Egypt is an anchor of stability. And yes, Egypt, hopefully, according to the statistics, according to the economic growth rate that we are attaining, we will not go back, but we are moving forward. And sorry for taking the much long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Harrer, would you? No. Okay.
Yes, yeah. Egypt needs support, no doubt about it. Yes, I know that there is a difficult situation with regard to human rights, and yes, Europe should pay much more, but on conditions. Keep in mind what I've said about the demographic developments.
Please, two final questions regarding the clock. Madam.
Okay, I will make it short. Thank you for the interesting discussion. Mr. Fasslabend, you discussed geostrategic and also geopolitical and military aspects of Taiwan-China issue. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about subversive actions from China towards Taiwan, and how do you assess them? Thank you very much.
And the last one for the gentleman on the end of the row. Yeah, Mr. Fasslabend.
Yeah, from my point of view, China has more or less the choice. Of course, they can go by military means. The easier way, of course, is just to buy out, try to buy out Taiwan, because the economies are very, very intertwined, you could say, and they probably will do the second thing. Whether they will start the first one, I cannot tell, but they certainly will try to do everything in order to get it back.
And please, final question.
Coming to Taiwan, the most important asset in Taiwan is, in my assumption, Taiwan Semiconductor, producing the best microchips on the planet. So having said, in 3 or 6 years there will be a military attack, can we create some simple scenarios? Attack 1 is China attacks and fails. China enters the island and there is a new Iron Curtain, or they totally take over Taiwan. Taiwan Semiconductor is now in the hand. What is the output for the Western world we are living in terms of, let's say, economical growth? So I would say hyperinflation. What are the scenarios? And you mentioned aeroplanes fly from America to Taiwan. You didn't mention the, how do you call this, aircraft carriers. Are they not in place?
Yeah, in order to start with the last question, you know, at least one of the scenarios even showed that America could lose 2 aircraft carriers, because of course they are huge, they are very big, and insofar they would be excellent aims for to be targeted by artillery or by rockets, missiles of any size. This is one thing. The other one is, you know, I would not dare really to make a judgment how strong any side will be in more or less preventing the other side to use certain tools. What I could say is that probably we will have to be aware that we go into a new phase about resources. I just came yesterday from a conference in Istanbul. The Russian deputy director of Diplomatic Academy made a statement over there, and more or less his statement was that the end of free access of the Western world to cheap resources has come. And this certainly will become one of the biggest wars in between the Western world and the East. You know, this is the fight for resources and the consequences. And whether this is natural resources or technical resources, both will be very important. I guess in this specific case, America can prevent China at least a few years. One should not underestimate. In a few years, of course, the situation will be over due to the technological potential China will have. And insofar, all these situations are flowing situations. They will change during the time.
Well, again, not a very optimistic scenario. I think we could talk for hours about everything. I was told we should stop after 2 hours. I thank you very much. I think it was yet a fascinating tour d'horizon on Global Hotspot. Mrs. Harrer, Mr. Fasslabend, Mr. Pusztai, Mr. Fechbar. Thank you very much. It was really an interesting evening. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Although it was not very enjoyable what we heard, but you really have the chance to listen to such distinguished and highly professional experts. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for watching us on live stream. I hope you have a safe journey home, and we still can hope that everything will not turn out as badly as it could be. Thank you very much.